I am moderating this myself this evening, which is totally fine, obviously. It just means I need to I'm just gonna admit everyone, give it a second. And hello, hello, hello. It's so good to see everyone's faces. Um, okay. I'm sure more people will hop on, but hopefully I can manage it. Okay, hi everyone. Due to some silly logistics things, I am also moderating this and teaching it. So that might get like a little bit annoying at various points. I apologize. Okay, and I'm gonna just put that. Those are the sources. So those are now in the chat. And they also, I think, got emailed out earlier. Okay, so this is the last class in the series, The Gates of Crying Were Not Locked, Crying Children, Crying Adults in Jewish Texts. And we kind of, in the last two classes, took a tour of more or less everyone who cries in the Torah, a bunch of people who cry in the Talmud. And what we saw overall was that the people who cry are not babies, which is just really interesting. And I think the thrust of that is that crying adults are just like a lot more interesting. They're ethically compelling. They might require or demand that we do something in a way that when babies cry, it maybe doesn't make that same kind of demand. It also could be that crying adults are notable because adults don't walk through this world crying all the time. But my 2-year-old cried through an entire Hanukkah Palooza event we just went to tonight. And that was actually not notable, half the other 2-year-olds they were also crying and it's just a thing that he does that's kind of annoying, but not wow, I need to tell you a story about that time my 2-year-old cried or that time my baby cried. That's not interesting, you know? So then the question is, okay, but there are times when crying babies are interesting or notable, and that those exist both in we're going to see just two quick midrashim at the start here, and then we're going to see a bunch of places in halacha where crying babies come up, and then we'll round it out with some chassidut and crying babies almost used as metaphors in that model in ways that I think are different and interesting, and that I think in the end of the day I kind of have some critiques of and or some of them at least, or at least the suggestion as to how to read it, and then we will wrap up and wish everyone a happy Hanukkah. Okay, so this is here, I'll just put this in here one more time for anyone who missed it the first time. And then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so just I mentioned before, we're down a moderator tonight. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, but also feel free to just interrupt me. And if it's not the right time, I'll just be like, hold that thought for a second. And that's totally fine. And that works for me perfectly well. So
Leah,
yes.
so before you get into with the children, after last week, the only thing I kept thinking the whole time was so the relationship of Yaakov and Rachel. It begins with him, he meets her at the well and he cries.
Mm-hmm.
And then she ends up after she's crying for all eternity for the children. So it begins with crying and it ends with crying.
I love that. Yeah. But she gets right, she's Ma'anali Nachem, but then they say to her, I mean, "Ikolach mibachi," right? So she ends like that. You're right. That's the last time we hear about her, and it's all about her crying, right? It starts with him crying, ends with her crying, right? It's very nice. And he's crying in reunion, and she's crying in disunion. And then they say, no, no, stop crying because Vishavu Banim Vulam, right? So which is almost the opposite. If she was Yaakov, then when the children come back, she would cry because Yaakov cries at reunions. Yeah, that's interesting. That's I like that framing. Thank you. Hang on one second. Oh gosh. What just happened here? Okay, great. All right, here we go. Try that. Okay, so as we mentioned previously, the like only baby who cries in all of Tanakh is Moshe, which is wild. And so when we have midrashim about crying babies, the midrashim that are like really based on the text are then also Moshe, but we just have this one that we didn't look at together. So the Gemara in Sota, because it's about not Moshe, but it's like premised on that. So the Gemara says, "V'lo yachla od hatzpino," or the pasuk says, "V'lo yachla od hatzpino." So by the way, if you ever have the opportunity to learn Sota, it's super interesting on a lot of levels, but also like it's a great like pre-Pesach learning. If you're like tired of Pesachim, or like you've learned Arvei Pesachim for the 80th time, open up the beginning of Sota, and it's full of these like amazing Shmot Midrashim. So this is one of them. Okay, so she couldn't hide him anymore, Yocheved or whatever, Bat Levi couldn't hide him anymore. And the question is, Amai, why is that? Oh, God, I put someone else in. Okay. V'titzpeneu v'tezil, right? She could just like, okay, she should just keep hiding him, right? You're hiding him, keep hiding him. So then they say, Ella kol hichadahavu shame mitzra'e demityali yanuka. So no, it wasn't possible because anywhere the Egyptians heard that a baby was born, mimatu yanuke hatam, they would bring another baby there. Ki hechi delishmeinu Uma'ave behadaye. Behadaye, sorry. So when the hidden baby would hear the Egyptian baby, the two would cry together. And then we have this like kind of insane proof text. Achazulanu shualim, shualim ktanim, mechablim kramim. Okay. So take us foxes, the little foxes, they spoil the vineyards. And Rashi, oh no, sorry, not Rashi. Rashi explains about the crying, but just the idea that like the Egyptian little babies that they brought to like set off the crying amongst the Israelite babies are these like little foxes that destroy vineyards is kind of like a fascinating midrashic hook happening here. And like I like that it's like, oh yes, like what are little foxes? Like there are these babies that like ferret other babies out of their hiding places, like that image is, I don't know, complicated. There's something cute about it and something horrible about it all at the same time. Okay. Um anyway, so Rashi on the Gemara there in Sota says, what is this like Ma'ave Bahadaihu? Rashi, but first of all, has a different gear. So he says Ma'ave Hatam, he would cry there. And he translates Vitzoik Sham, and he would scream there. V'darech Tinok Litzok Kisheshomea Kol Tinok Chavero. That it's the way of babies to scream when they hear other babies scream, which is sometimes true, not always true, but definitely a possibility. And so here, like I think what's interesting is that it's not like the fact of the matter that like, wow, a baby is crying. It's that babies crying have this sort of like tool possibility, like this usage. Like, oh, if you ever want to know if someone's hiding a baby, just like bring a screaming baby nearby, and the hidden baby like will reveal itself necessarily. It's like with if you're looking for gold, you have a metal detector, and you're looking for babies, you have a baby detector. And like, what is the baby detector? It's like other babies. So the usage of it is not to say babies are, I don't know, like babies have any special like characteristic or there's something ethically important about it or anything like that. It's just that like babies can be found in this manner. That's sort of one read. There's a different read, which is something that my spouse and I have been contemplating for a few years now, which is that babies are a huge liability, and that if you were trying to go be hidden, a baby is what's going to reveal wherever you're hidden because they cannot help but scream. And there's whatever. This is not so relevant, but we've been sort of wondering whether there's like a piece in like Jewish DNA where like you hear your baby crying and your DNA is like the Nazis are gonna find us. I don't know, whatever, if that resonates with people or not. That's definitely like something we've been wondering about ourselves as we parent small humans. Okay, so anyway, so that's this one sort of midrash where a crying baby does appear, and it appears as a tool for the finding of other crying babies, making crying baby number one, i.e., the Egyptian crying babies, into little foxes. Um, all right, so here we're in Rabbanit Machia, and um, where he's going is to the classic Gemara Midrash that we often find in Nida. It exists also in other sources, about the babies that learn everything when they're inside of their mothers and then forget it on the way out, and the angel hits them here, and that's why we have this dent, right? So that's kind of the premise here, or that's like one premise. This is a very, very, very long thing that he writes on Vayikra 18, and if I show it how. So this is where he goes into this like long discussion about like what karet is. And he goes through lots of other people's opinions about what karet is, and then his own opinion about what karet is. And if you have questions about what karet is, it's definitely worth a read of the whole gigantic long essay. But I just wanted to bring the part where a baby cries. So I cut out most of it, and like you'll see, like, wow, that's like a long source for what we're gonna be looking at tonight, but this is a teeny tiny fraction of this Rabbeinu Bachya. So he says, um, right, we have this midrash, "V'nichimo ner daluk al rosho v'tzofabo misofa alav ve'ad sofo," that you put when the baby's inside the womb, there's a burning light on top of the fetus's head, and that light enables it to see from one side of the world to the other. And then it quotes this pasuk from Eov that whole place in the Gemara, and also in all the midrashim about pregnancy, they all for some reason like really turn around Eov. Aviva Zornberg, for people who are interested, has like some insights about maybe what that's about, like why Eov is like where we go for thinking about pregnancy. But in any event, okay. But so just moving past that, right? So in the morning, the angel takes him. This part's like not in the Gemara. But Boker nodo malach molichol Gan Eden. So the angel takes him, brings him to Gan Eden. Mar elo tzadikim sham yoshvim v'ateroteim beroshem. And he sees the righteous, and they sit with their crowns on their heads. And the angel says to them, Malach omer lo teda mi halalu shataroed. Know who these people are that you're looking at. Halalu no true kamotcha. These people were created just like you, betoch me'e iman, just inside their mother's bowels, ve'atzu, and they came out ba'olam, into the world, v'shamru mitzvotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they kept Hashem's mitzvot, v'lakach zachu v'nizdamnu l'tova zeh, and that's why they merited and were invited into this amazing life that they have in Gan Eden, wearing their Gan Eden crowns. Ve'ata, and you also, sofcha latzit le'olam, you're also going to go out into the world. Ve'im tiskeh v'tishmor ha'Torah, and if you merit and you observe the Torah, tiskeh yeshivatam, you will merit to sit just like them. Ve'ilav teshiv v'makom acher, and if not, you will go somewhere else. And then what happens? La'erev molichol Gehenom. And then the evening, the angel brings the baby to Gehenom. Umar Elo Harashayim, and he sees all of the wicked people, Shator Dimotam, Malachei Chavala, B'makalot Shal Ish, that the angels of injury are torturing them with sticks of fire, and they call out, Vikorin, vai, they call out, whoa. And the angel says to them, Teda, you should know, Halal Nisrafim, Shanisrafim, these guys that are being burned, have no true kamodcha. They were created just like you. V'yatzu le'olam, and they went out into the world. V'lo shamru mitzvotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they didn't keep Hashem's mitzvot. V'lakach ne'anshu uva'u lecherpa hazu, and that's why they were punished, and they've come to this like disgraced state. V'ata, and you, sofcha latzit le'olam, you're also going to go out into the world. Havei tzadik va'al tihi rasha, be a tzaddik, don't be righteous, don't be wicked, leman tichya, so that you will live. And how do we know? Okay, we have this quote from Mishlei. And then when it is time for the fetus to go out into the air of the world, miyad hamalach makauto, the angel hits him, umechaben neiro, and extinguishes his light, umotzio ba'al korcho, and pulls him out against his will, v'shocheach kol ma shera'ah, and he forgets everything that he saw, and he takes him out into the air of the world. Okay, now we've gotten to the point. This is why the baby cries right when they get out into the world. Okay. That's like a really complicated idea because there's a few things that like don't really work about this version of this midrash. One is like if the baby forgets everything, then does it know that it forgot everything? In which case it's crying over the knowledge that it forgot, or it's just crying because it doesn't even know what's happening. Like it's kind of unclear what this crying is about actually within the context of this telling of the midrash. And also like that it cries now, but it didn't cry when it was like in Gehenna with the Malach. I don't know. I have a lot of questions about it's midrash here. But I do think that it's sort of interesting that it doesn't just say, oh, a baby comes into the world and it cries. What is it about crying? Well, it cries because babies cry, and you know your baby is alive if it cries, and then it's gonna cry a lot for the next 4 years, like shkoyach mazel tov, right? Like that's one read of that baby's first cry. Um, and instead of doing that, this midrash says, no, there's like something big and existential happening in that first cry. There's something I don't know, like almost like cosmic happening. Um, and yeah. Oh, sorry. And then the finishing here is like, why does Hashem, why does the Malach mishakeach ota? Like, why does the angel make him forget? This is a gzira of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, so that this is like a decree of God, Kadesh yishtadal v'yatriach belimud v'kabel schar, so that this baby will work hard and it will work hard of its own free will, and then it will receive merit for its hard work. So like at the end of this is also interesting, right? Like it has to do this, it has to forget so that it can end up in Gan Eden if it makes good choices. But this whole thing that it shows him Gan Eden and Gehenna and that makes him forget the whole thing is like, why do we even go on this tour? We're not gonna remember it. So the whole thing, like whatever. There's a lot of versions of this midrash, and I don't have as many questions about some of the others. Um, but this idea that shocheach kol ma shera'a motzi'o v'olam, where he forgets everything he saw, he's taken out into the air of the world, and this is what the baby is crying about. I think it is, like okay, if you forget about all my questions and you just take it as he spells it out, that the baby is crying over the forgetting, and it knows that it forgot, then that's a really powerful type of forgetting. And I think sometimes as adults, forgetting is really emotional. Um, like I know that like for me, like there have been times in my life when my memory is really not what it needs to be, like times when I've been very sleep deprived or whatever, like postpartum. And for me, it's like scary and emotional and so you can imagine that for this baby that forgot literally everything, it's like terrifying and but not just terrifying in the way of like I don't know normal terror like I think I'm gonna die kind of terror, terrifying in the like disorienting who am I kind of way. And then what we're doing here is ascribing um almost like a really adult version of emotional of tears to this baby. Like there's something that's very not like baby crying about this type of crying, that it's so emotionally complex. So putting forward as another um, possible understanding of like when babies are, yes, crying in our texts, they're crying in situations when adults would cry as well. Okay, so we're moving into just like a brief overview. Like this is like a tasting menu of like crying babies and halacha. There's way more where any of this comes from. All of these topics are kind of like discussed at length. Um, but I don't know. These are like I tried to give you a diversity. Okay, so who's the Lekat Yosher? So the Lekat Yosher is a student of the Trumat Hadeshen, Rabbi Israel Isserlin. He's writing in this really sort of pivotal moment in Ashkenaz. Like the Black Plague did a real doozy on Ashkenaz, and that you have a really kind of like destroyed community. Um, so to even have anyone who's writing in like the 1450s in Bavaria is like kind of amazing, frankly. And then what's going to happen in Ashkenaz is that in the 1500s, so really not very long after the Lakat Yosher, the Ramah is going to come along and like reconstitute the Ashkenazi Jewish community based not in Bavaria but out of Krakow. And that's a real turning point. But this is coming out of like one of the lowest, like darkest times in the history of Ashkenaz. And he's preserving the teachings of the Trumat Hadeshen. And for anyone who is Ashkenazi, a lot of your life is like turns on the teachings of the Trumat Hadeshen. Just probably no one ever taught you about it potentially, but you spend enough time with the Ramah and you realize that when he differs from the Shulchan Aruch, the Trumat Hadeshen is often involved. Okay, so here's like just one teaching from the Lekat Yosher. Amar, I think this is Mori Verabi, my teacher. Av al gav d'tnad b'perek Hamad Beitza. So even though it teaches in the first chapter of Beitza in Metavchin in Misavkin that you're not allowed to clap or strike a hand on Shabbat on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Mikol makom kedei lashtika tinok o ki agavna mutar lispo kaf al kaf. So you're allowed to quiet a baby with like a this on Shabbat and Yom Tov, even though normally you're not supposed to clap. So that's just like the beginnings of like, oh, like if we approach this with a question of are babies extenuating circumstances lechumra or lekula, like do they generate permissibility in this world or the opposite, which is kind of how I was thinking about it when I was putting this together. This would be a great example of babies generate kulas, and I don't mean like infants that are super delicate that like there's some sort of like deep concern about them. Like imagine like a 9 month old or something that you like a fat baby who can sit up on their own. Like that's the baby in my head when I'm doing this teaching. And obviously a 1 month old with so much greater needs and vulnerability is like a totally different conversation. So let's leave aside the vulnerable baby for this section and just like a totally happy, healthy, super like paperweight baby that just cries. Like what is generated by that crying? So in this instance, like that crying overrides a piece of Hilchot Shabbat, which is really interesting. You wouldn't necessarily think that you can violate even mitzvah d'Rabbanan for any sort of Rabbanan for like making a baby happy or calming a baby down. But here we have the Shema Veshen saying that we can. Okay, so that's like one piece. And then the next piece is this is building up to the Pele Yoetz. So I know we're a little bit out of order, but the Mishnah Berurah, I don't like to teach straight the Zohar in part because I never know what I'm talking about because the Zohar is just like in a language that I don't really understand. I'm just like owning that. And two is that halachically the Zohar is not important until someone makes it important. So meaning in the Zohar, but if no one brings it down, it's not important just because it's in the Zohar. It's important because halachic authorities took the Zohar and interpreted it to be important. So I'm just bringing you the Zohar that's under discussion. I'm bringing it to you from the Mishnah Berurah. So the Mishnah Berurah says Zohar Veviu Achronim, right? And he's saying like loads of people are quoting this and bringing it down, right? That's him saying the same thing that I said, right? The Zohar isn't important in and of its own. It's important because have you Achronim are quoting the Zohar. And here's the halacha they're bringing: Isha meineket lo tishamish ela b'shah shetinok yoshin. So a woman who's nursing shouldn't have sex except for when the baby is asleep. And after she has sex, lo tanika deyeled ad achar shiur hiluch shnei milin. So after sex, she shouldn't nurse until the amount of time it takes to walk to meal. So that we say it's about 15 minutes a meal, so wait half an hour. There's some debate about that, but I'm not so interested in that for this purpose. But if the baby is crying, tamtin lefachot shiur meal. If the baby is crying, then you should wait at least one meal. So you would wait 15 minutes. So that's also interesting. Like, what is the amount of time that we can tolerate a baby crying for? And the answer is like almost like lehalacha in the Mishnah Berurah, 15 minutes, which I think is just like tell that to a new mom, you know? I think that a lot of the times it's like, oh my gosh, my baby's crying. Like also because like your brain shuts down under those circumstances. Like I must address this immediately. Um, um, Hang on a second. We got a question in the chat. Couldn't the leket Yosher be talking about a case in which he is quieting a baby by a sharp sound? It's a case of hiding a baby from detection, not comforting the baby. Okay, so the language of like lahashtik makes it sound like we're like shutting you up or something, but it gets used so commonly to mean quieting in a like comfort way, and we're gonna see more and more of that. That I don't think we're in a world of like I have to hide this baby. I think we're in a world of like I'm trying to just get this baby to stop crying because like that's a thing that parents want to do. But it's not, yeah. And I also think that if it was a situation where like our lives are in danger, then like you could take even more extreme action than like clapping. So that's also why it's like sort of hard for me to like read it with that lens. Okay, so anyways, okay, so Mishnah Berurah, right? If your baby's crying, then you can have the time. Oh, and all this is premised, by the way, on this idea that appears a few different ways in halacha, which is that like breast milk can like go bad. So also you have like literally in the Shulchan Aruch, like not nursing if you're angry. And it's not about like it's funny because like we also have like don't have sex when you're angry, right? There's a few different like anger themed halachot that really like make it. And some of them are like interpersonal, like don't interact with your baby in anger, like that type of thing. It reads to me as like more scientific. Like you will give your baby bad milk if you nurse when you're angry. And like obviously telling that to someone who has like postpartum rage that's triggered by letdown is like I wouldn't tell that person that halacha necessarily. Also because like we have these sorts of big questions about like when halachot are seem to just be like the Shulchan Aruch scientific opinion and not like more than that. What do we make of that type of thing? So that's also kind of complicated. But at any rate, they definitely have this concept that like your breast milk can go bad, and that's like what motivates this. And by the way, right, like we also have that just vis-a-vis alcohol. So it's like, oh, if you drink too many like hard drinks and you like if the language people use now is like if it's not safe for you to drive, then you shouldn't be breastfeeding. And like it's not so dissimilar. Like there is a version where your breast milk would be bad for your baby. And it's not just because like you're too sloshed to like hold your baby. It's literally that like your baby would get taken alcohol through your milk. Okay. So it's not like so crazy. Anyways, whatever. The idea that your breast milk can go bad, like we kind of still have that, is all I'm trying to say. But we would say it for different reasons. So, anyways, here's
Yeah,
the
I think that's,
evaluates. Oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was just like thinking about that as well. Like with alcohol in particular, like you're actually 1 cup, you're supposed to wait an hour, 2 cups, you're supposed to wait 2 hours because the amount of concentration in your blood and therefore in your milk, like changes over time. So it very much feels similar where like there's your sex does something to your blood does something to your milk, and you have to wait so that the concentration of that is no longer like at, you know, at a point that your baby can't tolerate it. Obviously, like that's not the case, and having sex does not like impact the concentration of your blood or your milk or
Yeah,
whatnot.
but
But
they don't
it
know this
actually is
stuff.
like super like it feels kind of scientific, which is like interesting to me, very
Yeah, yeah,
interesting to
yeah.
me.
And they have lots of like there's loads of like science around breast milk, including amazingly, the Gemara is like, you know what's great for pregnant and nursing women? Wine. Which is
Oh
like,
no, deep.
whoops. Um, but okay, Liz says it's always interesting when their science and our science overlap and differ. Yes, exactly. That's what Hannah was saying. And thinking about how they would have felt about these rules the way we feel about medical advice. Yeah. But I think that like this is something that like obviously if anyone here is like a history of science person, I'm sure Dr. Baker and other people have feelings about this, but like medicine and philosophy used to be like the same field. Like the idea, like, oh, Rambam, he was like a philosopher and a doctor. Like, I don't think he recognized the distinction between those two things. And like similarly the Ramban and whatever. And so also like that we draw different like lines through knowledge than they did, if that makes sense. Like our subdivisions of like fields, that's what we call it, fields. Our fields are constructs, right? Like someone just decided, like, oh, you study this thing, you belong in poli-sci. You study this thing, you belong in philosophy. Like, you study this, you're in comp lit. You study this, you're in regular lit. Like, says who, you know? Like, I don't know, right? So I think that's also like a piece of what this is about. Okay,
And
so
yet,
okay, go ahead.
all terminal academic degrees are still Doctor of Philosophy.
Yeah. I mean, don't tell that to your friends who have PsyDs, but yes. Totally. Right, because philosophy is like the catch-all of knowledge. Okay, so the Paleoites, you might not have heard of him. Oh, I was gonna have show and tell, and then I put it away. But there are some communities, even today, where like this guy, Rabbi Papo, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He's living in Bulgaria, but it was like the Ottoman Empire back in the day when he was living there. Like they bring him in, like you'll see English guidebooks coming out of the Haredi community that just quote him like the same way they quote the Mishnah Brura or whatever. So that's all to say, like, if you've never heard of the Paleoites, like that, you know, you're living a great life, like that's totally fine. But I would say like he's in certain circles, he's very popular. You can find all like a huge amount of his writing actually is surprisingly on Sefaria. When I went looking for this, I just like put it in there as like, oh, who knows, they have all kinds of random stuff, and like lo, they have this. So it's really interesting because it's this like halacha slash musar work, but that people like take his musar and read it through like a halacha lens. So I actually found out about this from like a Haredi parenting guidebook that quotes it, and without any distinguishing between this and like something that's in the Shulchan Aruch, which is also like not the approach to Musar literature that like I live with. Okay. So he quotes the same Zohar that the Mishnah Berurah quotes. And then okay, but the point is, right? Ima yeled bochaber via sha'a sagi mishum tzara zinuka. Oh, also he like takes a stand about how much a meal is. So I said the same thing for to you guys that he says, which is like 2 meal would be half an hour, 1 meal would be quarter of an hour. So if the baby is crying, then you just need to wait a quarter of an hour, and and the reason for that is because the baby is suffering. Sa'ar zinuka. Right, which also, by the way, this is like kind of the first time we've seen explicitly that the baby is suffering, right? So when we've seen, oh, we want the baby to stop crying, let's say, in the Leke Usher, like maybe that was about the baby, but maybe it was about other people who are just like made uncomfortable by the baby, you know? And if a baby is comforted by going like this, then clearly they weren't in so much pain. It's like how you know, like if they're hungry or not, is if you give them a pacifier and it quiets them, because like they're not idiots, like they know that they're not getting nutrition out of that thing. So like if they're actually hungry, the pacifier is not going to do the thing, you know? Anyways, okay. So this is the first time we've really seen babies crying because it is suffering. And then he says, Rabim ein yodim beiser zeh. A lot of people have never heard of this prohibition. Can confirm. But say ulmad, go out and see kama chashashu al tzar zinika. But go and see how much our tradition cares about the suffering of babies. Okay, that's like a really amazing line, because actually, I think what we've seen together is that our tradition doesn't have very much space at all for crying babies. And he is saying, yeah, look, this line, this like halacha in the Zohar that gets brought down, like, I mean, he's before the Mishnah Berurah, but whatever, like that gets brought down by lots of achronim. It shows how much we care about babies suffering, which is just like, I don't know. I think like there could have been a more robust literature on this subject. Anyways, okay. So he says, look how much they care. Ad shehitiru tzad nidnudi sur mishum tara. Until they permitted this like tzad ninud. I think the best way, it's like a, I don't know, so maybe Liz is gonna come in with like a great translation for this, but it's like a smidgen, I think is how I would say it. Like a smidgen of a prohibition because of the baby's suffering. Now, I would say like adult suffering, or really anyone suffering, does more than that. Like, if you have like a rabbinic level prohibition and then you're like suffering, usually under many circumstances, you can roll back that rabbinic level prohibition, right? So like suffering carries a lot of halachic weight normally. So there's like a whole lot that's like not so consistent in what he's saying, is what I'm trying to say. However, he's bringing it for a Musar lesson for nursing moms. Vadai she'otan hanashim shemenichore elidei hamyom keshadayim shivchu zman rav ad shigmeru iskayam o ad da'avdei maidabo atido litain et hadin. But for sure, those women who leave their nursing babies that they cry for a long time until they like finish the thing they're doing, or they're doing whatever they're doing, they are going, in the future, they will face judgments. Dun, dun, dun. So says the Paleoites, leaving your baby to cry while you're doing something else, you will face judgment for that in the future. But I would just say, like, if it took until the Paleoites to hear someone say that, it like tells you about like the strength of that idea within our tradition. Okay. Not to say that our tradition thinks you should like ignore babies or leave them out to dry, for sure not. But his narrative about like how important the cries of babies are, I think we've really seen that that's like not so well represented in the text. Okay. So the other, so he is saying again that the crying of the baby creates a kula. Now we're going to see an area of halacha where a crying baby maybe does not create a kula, though I would say that this Shara Tziyun that we're about to see in source 7, there's a lot, I'm just going to like flag for you, there's a lot of tshuva literature that takes this to town, and many people think that it's like wrong or can be overturned or whatever. Okay, for many different reasons. So once I tell you what it is, I'll break down why a lot of people don't like it. So here's the, oh wait, we got a chat. Here we go. I do think there's a tendency to take baby suffering less seriously. Babies cry, a reasonable and common refrain. Halacha tends to respect the pain that people can articulate, and somewhat definitively, babies cannot do that. Sort of. I mean, crying is an articulation of pain. I don't know exactly, but I also think that like babies overstate their pain. Like, I think it's kind of complicated, right? Maybe that's what you're saying. Like, babies can't articulate their pain because their articulation of pain sounds the same as their articulation of I'm bored, or I want this choking hazard, or whatever, right? Like, I want to stick my fingers into a socket. Why won't you let me? Like, it all kind of sounds the same at the end of the day, right? And babies can't say why. Yeah, that's also very reasonable. I'm just reading Liz's comments out of the chat for anyone who's not following along there. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Yes, I agree with what you're saying. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Nashim hamizamru b'peh be'et malachtan. So women. Oh, so here's what the Mishnah Berurah says. By the way, Siman Tav Kuf Samech is all about like Zecher LeMikdash things. Like we're in a very like interesting like Siman in the Shulchan Aruch that this comes up here. So just like kind of flagging that that's like interesting. We're in a discussion about whether like anyone can sing or make music at all now that the Beit Hamikdash is destroyed. Like that's the frame for this halachic discussion in 560. Okay, so Nashim mizamru b'peh be'et malachtan yesh l'kol b'han. Women who sing with their mouths while doing work, one should oppose it. And in the Mishnah Berurah here, it's actually not clear that that's about kol isha. It's about just the creation of music altogether, which is like really intense. Like the Gemara, like this siman ends with the idea that like people should never fill their mouths with laughter. Like that's where the Shulchan Aruch here is headed, and the like the conversation around the Shulchan Aruch also. Okay, so then the Mishnah Berurah in the Shara Hatzion says he like picks up the thought where it left off. He continues it. V'im mizamru kidei liashin hatinok shapir dami. But if they're singing in order to put their baby to sleep, then maybe it's okay. Achin im yesh anashim achirim b'bayit yesh lizaher mishum kol isha. But if there are men at home, then you have to be careful because of kol isha. So what does this mean? On the one hand, we have this prohibition on making music, but the crying baby creates heter on that prohibition. On the other hand, the crying baby does not override kol isha. So now we're starting to get a picture of like, okay, what are the types of things where the crying baby generates permissive opportunities, and what are the things that it's like, nope, I don't care. What I do want to say is that some of the discussion about this is really interesting, because it's like, why are women allowed to sing while they're working, but not allowed to sing if there's men around with their baby? And then it's like, oh, well, if the like men know about it, then they can leave, or like, but there's like a lot of different, or like they know that it's not meant to be sexual, which is something that like starts to come up here for people following the modern kol isha discourse, like coming out of places like Yeshivat Har Etzion. And that's like the big turning point is the singing sexual or not? And then so to see it reflected like in this conversation so explicitly is really is quite interesting. Anyways, all of that, like many asides, you can really like follow this Shar Hatzion through like there's like no modern posek who doesn't have an opinion about it. And that's like quite interesting. Yes. Okay. Newborns and very young babies do not have wants, only needs. That is true. Okay. I said at the beginning of this discussion, like I'm imagining like a fat 9-month-old in this conversation. Because yes, totally. Newborn's different planet for sure. I totally agree. Okay, so now let's talk about shul. For people who have ever been to my shul, you will know that it is overrun with small children, and that's actually a controversial take. So we're about to see some halachic discussion about that. And you know, whenever we think about children in shul, you always have to read a text like this and wonder, like, what is the weight behind it? Like a lot of the time, not, you know, the Rambam is so explicit, like he'll always tell you, is this d'oraita, is this d'Rabbanan, is this, like, what level of thing are we talking about? Not everyone in the halachic conversation is going to do that. And then as the reader, it's your job to say, is this Musar? Is this d'Rabbanan? Is this, or is Musar minhag d'Rabbanan d'oraita? And that's always like a lens question to bring to text like some of the ones that we've been seeing. Obviously, it's complicated and difficult to do. Okay. So the Aruch HaShulchan has this strong opinion that is not held by everyone, which is that even motioning to someone constitutes a disruption to your tefillah. So he says, Lo rak hefsek dibor asur b'tefillah v'hefsek hiluch. It's not just that talking is a prohibited disruption. Also, walking is a prohibited disruption. Even hinting or like hand motions or things like that. Remizah can mean a bunch of different things. But it means like at its core, it means hinting, but it can mean like, like a something like that. And in the context here, he's also talking about like, let's say there's someone who the Shliach Tzibor is waiting for Chazarat Hashatz for that person, and they're like still davening and they want to be like this, or like go, start Chazarat Hashatz, don't wait for me. So that's a piece of the context here. And so that, right, so even this constitutes remizah. So he says that's prohibited. But yesh mi shematir kshetinok bocha umeval below betfilatos. But there are some who permit when a baby is crying, and the baby's crying is messing up your tefillah. L'ramiz lo biadav shelo yivkas. So you can use your hands to like hint to the baby that he shouldn't cry. Ve'imeno mo'il, and if it doesn't work, yarchik atzmo mimenu, right? It's so interesting because sometimes, every time until now, it's been about the baby. Now it's about you. This baby is causing me harm by getting in the way of my davening. And it's not about quieting the baby so the baby will find comfort. It's about shutting the baby up, which is kind of strange and kind of interesting. And if that doesn't work, right, so then it's not about making the baby stop crying, it's I'm going to distance myself from the baby. And he says, but best of all, when a baby is crying and it's confusing you, just keep davening and Hashem will help you. Which I feel like there's even my show where it's like full of children and whatever. If a baby was like screaming their face off during Shemona Esrei, the parent would take them out. The Aruch HaShulchan, and it's not, this is I'm happy to send people who are interested. There's like a Tchumen article about this and like a lot of discussion on this exact subject. The Aruch HaShulchan is not who we follow in this case, but he would say, your baby's screaming in shul and it's messing everyone up. Hashem should help their davening. Don't stop davening to take care of the baby. Okay, that's the Aruch HaShulchan. Anyone who like lived it all, we're gonna see this story in a second, but like anyone who like went to the gush already like that idea that like you just keep davening even while the baby's screaming, like that's actually a hard concept if you have like Rabbanit in your head, and we're gonna get to Rabbanit in a second. Okay. So Mishnah Berurah here says, I'm not going to read this inside because we're already kind of low on time, but the Mishnah Berurah says like, problem solved. Don't bring your kids to shul. It's bad for their education, and it's bad for shul, and they don't learn Kedushat Beit HaKnesset because small children are incapable of behaving in shul. Okay, I asked, it was the Aruch HaShulchan talking all tefillah, specifically Shemona Esrei. So I think he means specifically Shemona Esrei, but he also makes reference to Kriyat Shema. So those are like the two biggies for Hafsei. Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, I don't really think we have so much time to give to some of these like really fun shuvot that I have here. But I'll just tell you about them. So this is Ramosha Stern. He was born in Slovakia in 1914. Post-war, he actually returned to Hungary, tried to reconstitute the community, and I don't know, I'm going to butcher how you pronounce this place, but Debrecen or something like that. And then he went to Buenos Aires when things got bad again in Hungary, and eventually made his way to America. And when he was in America, he was really considered like one of the Gedolei America. Like he was very influential in his time. People might have heard, I've taught before for Drisha, not that everyone remembers everything I've ever taught or it's come to all the classes I've ever taught, but I've taught some Bezalel Stern, so that's his brother, just to like put that into the Stern rabbinic family. Okay, so here we go. So he is asked this is in the context, there's like a bunch of Nida questions all in a row. So if your wife is holding the baby and she's Nida, can you hold hands with the baby that's like on her lap? Okay, like how does that work for Hilchot Nida? And he says, listen, like doesn't seem like good policy. It seems like in order to do that, like you're getting really close to your wife, and you have to just like you have to be really careful, and that doesn't seem like a good idea. But he says if the baby's crying and refusing to eat, and the only way that the baby's going to eat is if you are playing with the baby, and then it will calm down, chill out, and be ready to eat, then you should do it. And then the reason why you can do it is because you're just totally focused on your work. I also love this description that it's work to get the baby. It's cute, right? Ha'av b'malachto. The father is in work mode, getting this baby to eat, which is just great. And he's like doing like a craft, and which it really is. And he's he's getting the baby to be quiet. And he's not flirting with his wife. He's not thinking about her. There's nothing inappropriate happening here. And there's no chashash hergel avira ki nir ali. So he says, like, if that's the dynamic, then like, yeah, you got to do that. And it's totally fine. Okay, so that's a situation where, again, the crying baby generates a heter, because you're like locked in on the baby and the baby's needs. And I think that the like crying plays into that. Okay, so this is the Chashukei Chamed. I really like the Chashukei Chamed. And this is Rabbi Zilberstein. He's still alive. He's quite old. He lives in Bnei Brak. He is really great at like baby and like pregnancy themed stuff. He wrote a phenomenal sefer called Torah Hayuledet. It's just full of wonderful things. Okay, so he gets asked the question that is at the intersection of parenting and being a neighbor. So the question is, if my baby cries a lot at night and the doctor told me that I should sleep train the baby. Right, so the doctor, let the baby cry it out for a couple of nights, and then when he realizes that like no one's coming to play with me, then it'll stop crying. And so the parents wanted to do this, but then the neighbors, complained, and they said, I can't sleep with their baby crying. The parents have to quiet their baby. And the parents say that no, this was on the doctor's advice. This is for health reasons. It doesn't matter that it bothers you. And so then, okay, I'm not going to take you through the whole thing, but it's very funny. He quotes this very interesting Tshuva the Red Baz. And he says that actually it kind of would depend on whether this is like a normal thing that people are doing or not. And also, like, okay, it was the doctor's advice, but we see lots and lots of babies whose parents calm down at night, and they grow up just fine. So that at the end of the day, he rules that the parents need to take responsibility for the experiences of their neighbors, and either they need to quiet the baby at night, or they need to like block up all the windows and like put up some like sound canceling situation. I'll just note when our baby was born in Chicago, and I asked people like, what do you do? Like if your baby cries at night, like your babies cry, like they cry at night, like what? And people said that they gave out gift baskets to their neighbors. So I would just say like this is definitely a thing that people do, to take responsibility for the neighbor's experience when bringing a newborn home to an apartment. Okay, in the last 7 minutes here. Okay, just to wrap up the halacha section. So in halachic literature, we start to see babies appear because halacha is about everything, and babies exist. They are part of the everything. But they appear, just in those like sort of normal everyday questions of like, I'm a parent and it's Shabbos and my baby is screaming, and if I go like this, my baby stops crying. Can I do that? Or like my wife is Nida, the baby's on her lap, right? Like these hard parenting situations that start to come up. And that's where you start to see, oh, there are crying babies. But it's never that the crying baby like symbolizes anything bigger than like just facts of life. Like, right? And I think that's sort of interesting. Like this baby exists, it exists in the world, it does these things, it has these needs, but it's not like compared to other types of crying where we saw something much bigger. In halachic literature, it's literally just about like the logistics and mechanics of like a peaceful life. And I do think that peace is, and that was like part of the reason for ending with that Chashukei Hamed, that piece is like a non-small piece of that component of the a non-small component of the halachic literature around crying babies. And it's interesting then that even though that comes forward as a value, right? Because if we said it doesn't matter if your baby's crying, we don't care that your baby's crying, because the Gemara doesn't say anywhere that you should quiet a baby, which is also so interesting, right? The Gemara doesn't say anywhere you should quiet a baby, therefore there's no reason why your crying baby should like make a claim that would override Shabbat, particularly if there's no health concern, right? Like I think that first Truman Adeshin is so interesting, right? There's clearly no health concern if your baby can be quieted by going like this. And yet you can do it, which is amazing. And I think that's like where it gets to be really interesting, where you start to have values around crying babies that appear almost like out of the ether. Like you can say, having a peaceful home, having a home where people are comfortable. I can provide tons of halachic literature to support that, but seeing a baby as a component part of that, like, kind of comes out of nowhere, which I just think is so interesting. Okay, we're gonna not spend so much time on this, but the sources 12 and 13 are both Rabbi Nachman of Breslov in two different works. And here we'll just look at 13. They kind of say the same thing, but he's trying to distinguish between brokenheartedness and depression. So atzivut is not for Rabbi Nachman, it's not like casual sadness. It's like depression. He says it comes from the spleen, and it's a form of anger and irritation. But brokenheartedness is, here's where we get to it, right? Kavan hamichata lifnei aviv, ketinok shebocha, v'kobel lifnei aviv, al shenitrachik mimanu. Okay, so all of a sudden, first of all, we have babies who are crying for emotional reasons. This is a baby that's crying not because it's hungry and not because it's poopy, but a baby that's crying because its father is too far away. And for Rabbi Nachman, that becomes this very powerful, like, tefillah metaphor. Yeah, like, you should be in a place where your father, i.e. Kadosh Baruch Hu, is too far away, and that breaks your heart, and that makes you cry. And when a baby does that because its caretaker is too far away, that's just like the metaphor that he's using. But all of a sudden, for Rabbi Nachman, it becomes the baby's cries become this very powerful metaphor for how we should all feel about, like, we should all like have attachment issues with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, basically, is where Rabbi Nachman takes this. And so this baby crying, all of a sudden, it's not just the logistics of life and the moving through my home and like the creation of a peaceful home. It's actually, no, I'm going to look to this crying baby and be religiously inspired by it, which is not really something that we've seen until now. And then he says, you should have a broken heart every day. And I forget which one he says it in. I think in the previous one, I think in source 12, where he says, like, yes, you should, like, oh no, here at the end here, right? Okay, so you should set aside a certain time each day to have your broken heart, and then the rest of your day you should be in joy. Like only Rabbi Nachman would say something like that. Like you have all these wild, intense emotions inside of you, like organize your life accordingly. So like have some day, so like a couple hours of the day of brokenheartedness, and then like wrap that up and move on. Which is just like amazing. But anyways, the idea that we would look to the crying baby for ethical and spiritual inspiration start like this is newish here. Okay, so here's Rav Amital. I'll just read this in English. A group of students were looking for a yeshiva. This is him telling about, like, how did I articulate to people what the gush, what Yeshivat Har Etzion is all about. Group of students were looking for yeshiva. They came and they said, what's going to be special about my yeshiva? And I, or Rabbi Tal, told them the following story. The Baal Tanya had to flee his home and he settled in a different place. And there he received a small apartment along with his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek. There were 3 rooms. In the inner room, the Baal Tanya sat and learned. And in the middle room was the Tzemach Tzedek. And in the first room was a baby in a cradle. One day during their learning, the Baal Tanya felt the baby crying. He left his room, passed by the Tzemach Tzedek's room, and he hadn't felt or heard the cries. The Tzemach Tzedek hadn't felt or heard the cries of the baby. The Baal Tanya saw that the baby had fallen. He returned the baby back to its bed, and once the baby had settled, he returned to his room. When he passed by the room of the Tzemach Tzedek, he said to him, if you study Torah and don't hear the cries of the Jewish baby, something is pagum, something is rotten in your learning. And so Rabbanit concludes, we want to learn Torah and listen and hear the cries of the baby. This is like, I don't know, for me, grew up in a very like Yeshiva Hartzion inspired atmosphere. This story was so instrumental that when I started looking into crying babies and realized that they were like effectively absent from the Torah and the Talmud, I was like floored, because this image of the crying baby in Rav Amital's Torah was so central. This was like, what does it mean to be a good Jew in this world? It means to be sitting in your learning and have your learning disrupted by the crying baby. And all of a sudden to realize that like that's like brand new. Was really just like, first of all, like from that perspective, really interesting. But also, the reason why I got into this was because when I had a crying baby at home, and all of a sudden it was super disruptive to my ability to learn, to my ability to work, to my ability to teach, to my ability to function, to my ability to daven, right? Like, what does it mean to open a siddur while your baby is crying? Every mother has to make that decision, basically. Like, okay, I can start crying while my baby is asleep, but my baby might wake up, and then what am I gonna do? The Aruch HaShulchan says super clear, like, just keep going. And Rav Amital says not really from a halachic perspective, right? He just says, like, be the type of person who stops your learning in order to tend to the baby. But the amazing thing about this story, and one that I didn't really realize until I embarked on this project, is that the crying baby for Rav Amital, like, this is like a one-off story. Like, one day the baby cried and I had to tend to it, as opposed to like every 3 hours of my life for 6 months, you know? And that's like a really different dynamic, right? Like, this story is told through a non-primary caretaker perspective. Because it's not the case that that baby that was living with the Balatanya and the Tzemach Tzedek cried only one time in its whole life and it fell out of its crib. Like, that just is not a possibility. That's not real. And so there's a way in which like this story actually is a beautiful story about like what a yeshiva should be about. But yeshivot are places where babies are a rarity. And in a yeshiva where babies really are all the time, like for example, Drisha's yeshiva, you actually need a different orientation around crying babies. And so that's just something that like I had to sort of unlearn. I had to unlearn this idea that a part of your spiritual life is to hear the crying baby, because I mean, not to say that you shouldn't, of course you should, but if your spiritual life is tethered to davening and learning, then as a mom who's a primary caregiver, you have to be okay with like, okay, sometimes I'm gonna finish up my amida and my baby's gonna be wanting to eat, and I'm just gonna finish my amida, and like that's okay. And I'm gonna adopt the Aruch HaShulchan's perspective on this instead of the Rav Amital perspective, with the understanding that the Rav Amital perspective wasn't written for me, wasn't written for a primary caretaker like role. It's written for a yeshiva student role in the life of a rarity baby that cries one time. And I think, you know, I have the same feelings about this other classic story, and I know people are putting things in the chat, but we're ending with this. So this story is told in a few different places, always about different people, so unclear whether it was actually Rabbi Yisrael Salanter who the story is told. I mean, surely the story is told about him, unclear whether it actually happened, even though, you know, it probably happened like somewhere in the like 1850s to 1880s, so that's not actually all that long ago. But the story is like too much of it appears in too many different places about too many different people to feel confident that this is about him. But right, one year he doesn't show up to Kol Nidre and everyone's like, oh my gosh, where's the Rav? Where's the Rav? Where's the Rav? And then it turns out that he had been on his way to Shul, and instead of making it, he passed by a house where there was a baby crying, and he stayed with the baby instead of going to Shul. And there's this like implicit critique in many versions of the story where mom had gone to Shul and he stayed with the baby instead of going to Shul, and there's critique of mom. Whereas I would say, like, Rabbi Salanter, did you daven chakras this morning? Great, like, stay home with the baby and let mom go to Kol Nidre. But in any event, different perspectives obviously are available for this. But again, it's like another story about a crying baby, where like a man encounters a crying baby one time, versus the like ongoing like needs of care, which are much more reflected in the halachic literature actually about babies. And that's sort of just like true to all topics in Torah, where like you get to the halacha and you're like, oh, this is how I can learn about like what things are really like that's where it comes up in halachic literature. And things kind of become metaphorized in later like stories and things like that in ways that are complicated. And when it comes to crying babies, I think the thing that's so fascinating is how late that happens, that it's not happening in the Torah, and it's not happening in the Gemara. It's really happening in these much later stories. I think for someone like me who wants to read these stories and say like, I have a problem with this, it opens up a door to that critique, especially because it appears so late. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna look at all the amazing things that people have shared in the chat. Okay. Every other time could arguably be the parents or other people's tsar. Yeah. It's about, oh, I see. Liz, I don't really know what this was about. Sorry, this feels like the first time since the Midrash. Oh, the baby falling out of the bed. Is that what you were saying that about? Oh, Rabbi Nachman. Yeah, definitely the baby. Okay. And the Balatanya felt the cries and then instructs us to listen and hear the cries. Is there anything to this difference? I don't know. That's a difference that exists in the Hebrew. Like Hirgish is the language of feeling, and then it's like Lishmoa, and some other Lakshiv, I think was the other language, in the like end of the story, and the like Rav Amital talking to the students part of the story. It's sort of interesting. Like I wonder about when I read this also, I wondered about the language of Lahargish there. I don't know, like the story was not written. Like the story is what I put in here is a transcription. You can actually watch Rav Amital telling this story on VBM. This is a transcription of him telling it. So but like to approach that sort of oral thing with the same like lens that we would use on a text feels a little bit tricky to me. Like, what's the difference between Lahargish and Lakshiv? Was he just trying to switch up the words, or was he actually saying, no, like 3 doors down and deep in learning, he actually like sensed the baby crying, but he wasn't actually like hearing distractions or something? I don't know. It's a good question, Elizabeth. I also noticed that when I was putting it in and was like, I'm not gonna edit it. Like I don't know, but I don't have deep insight about it. Okay, I am way over time. Let me just, oh, okay, Hannah, whoa. In the Oppenheimer movie, it shows how Oppenheimer was a brilliant mind, great at learning, but also shows how he was a terrible father, left parenting to his wife, which led to his children's neglect, including crying without being tended to. I think that's what it's talking about here. If you're needed at home, you should be at home, not with your Torah, or otherwise your Torah is rotten. Totally, but I do think that it's complicated, right? Because like, there's a difference between neglect altogether versus like I can do zero spiritual, right? Okay, let me say this differently. The Pella Yoetz said like you can let your baby cry for 15 minutes versus like that Rav Amital story like really is like, oh my gosh, your baby is crying, you're not allowed to like think about anything else or like do anything else in the meanwhile. And even that like 15-minute margin actually feels really important to me. Like, yes, you should tend to your baby, yes, you should make sure that your baby is not left like crying and alone and in need of something, but also like if you like finally took a shower and daven shacharis and you're in the middle of the Amidah, like it's okay. Like your baby can cry for 5 minutes, or like you're dealing with your other kid and like you're in the midst of like caretaking, and like your baby is crying, like okay, but like your 5-year-old also needs you, your toddler also needs you,
I think like I
yeah.
wonder if like in the Rav Hall story, the fact that like the Balatanya didn't even hear the baby crying is the important part. Like perhaps you can hear the baby crying and make like a calculated decision, like I'm gonna finish this parak, I'm gonna finish Shemona Esrei, I'm gonna do what you have to do. But if you don't even register that, then there's something wrong, because like you should register it. It should be you should be calculating it. Like, it shouldn't just be like your baby can cry forever and you don't hear. I don't think it means you need to respond, but it needs to at least like register at some level. And I feel like that's the way that you can kind of like make both of those sources work. Like, as long as you're hearing if you hear your baby crying, yes, you could take that 15 minutes like you need, but you need to have heard the baby cry.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's a really good, I think that's a really good way of like weaving the two together. That like you're gonna register that the baby is crying, but it doesn't necessarily demand immediate intervention as long as like you know that your baby is safe or things like that.
Yeah.
Right? Because also like the other thing that I feel like gets like under taught in the Rav Amital story is that the baby had fallen. Like, right? It's not like, oh, this baby is crying because like it woke up, and very frequently when babies wake up, they cry. It's actually like this baby was like potentially in danger, potentially injured, like, yeah. Okay, Kaya wants you to know more things about Christopher Nolan.
Oh, that's not important.
Okay, I'll just say some things to wrap up, which is that thank you all for coming to the series and for learning through this material with me. When I started like getting interested in this, I just thought it was like, I don't know, like wild. Like so much of my life for the past number of years has been so like determined by like who in my family is screaming, that the idea that it would just be like so absent from Torah literature was actually like a pain point almost. So to see it very present in halachic literature was then like, okay, like I'm not the first person on earth that this has like mattered to. And that was very helpful. And then like on further reflection about the absence of it in early literature gave me some almost like chizuk of like, yeah, you need to make sure your baby's okay, but it's not like it doesn't demand the same weight as adult crying. It doesn't ask of you the same thing. It doesn't require like maybe you have to go and show up with your body, but like or whatever, you know, or like provide food or whatever it is that your baby needs. But it's not the like it doesn't need to demand all of the like emotional input that is very frequently into to babies crying, and that maybe like it's a stance of just more acceptance. Like babies cry, you tend to them, like that's how they communicate that they need tending, but it's not the same as an adult crying over some like massive emotional thing, and drawing that distinction really kind of explicitly by the complete negation of babies crying is actually, I think, a really important teaching at the end of the day, about how to think about a baby's crying, and not urging towards neglect, but urging towards like, let's be clear about what this means and what it doesn't mean, which I think is actually really hard. It's a really hard distinction as a parent, and as a person who lives in a world where babies cry. So anyways, thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. I bet Chaya wants to tell you some things that are upcoming at Drisha, if I had to guess. And if people want to keep in touch about any of this or whatever, I'm still sarna@drisha.org. So people have questions or thoughts, really always glad to hear them. And I really, really, really appreciated everyone's insights that were shared with this material. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. I enjoyed this series so much, and just yeah, so much there. I'm like so excited, like for your book and like just watching this grow. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us all these weeks. I apologize again for mix up at the beginning of today's class, but I'm really glad it went well. Thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to learning with you again soon. Good night, everyone.